A soft rain had begun to fall over Atlanta, the kind that seemed to drift rather than drop, blurring streetlights into hazy halos as evening settled in. Marcus Reed watched the weather through the smudged window of his modest apartment, listening to the rhythm of it tapping against the glass. The place was small enough that he could follow every sound it made: the hum of the old refrigerator, the faint buzz of a streetcar outside, the sigh of the building as the temperature shifted. He had learned to find a strange comfort in these things, a steady background to the quietness that had taken over his life since Maya left. Marcus had always lived simply. He worked long hours as an engineer at a local manufacturing firm, balancing spreadsheets and maintenance schedules, fixing machines so other people could keep the place running. It wasn't glamorous, but he was good at it. He kept to himself, showing up early, leaving late, skipping lunch more often than not. His coworkers liked him well enough, but most didn't know much about him besides the fact that he was reliable, intelligent, and the kind of man who didn't raise his voice unless there was a real reason. For a long time, Maya had said those qualities made her feel safe. She used to tell him that he was the calm in her storm, the anchor she wished she'd had growing up. She admired his quiet confidence, the way he never tried to impress anyone, the way he moved with thoughtfulness rather than rush. When they first met at a charity volunteer event 3 years earlier, she had gravitated toward him instantly. She said he had this kindness that felt rare. He thought she was brilliant, driven, and beautiful in a way that drew attention without her ever trying. They built their life around shared dreams, whispered over late-night takeout dinners and long Saturday mornings. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Marcus began to notice small changes, like how Maya had started checking her phone at dinner more often, or how she had begun comparing their life to others they knew. She came from a family who measured success by visible markers: expensive homes, luxury cars, shiny rings, and the kind of vacations she saw displayed across social media. She had grown up believing that achievement meant having something dazzling to show for it. At first, she was able to separate that world from the one she shared with Marcus. But soon, the lines blurred. She spent more time scrolling through real estate listings far above anything they could afford, then sighing as she closed them. She began pointing out how her friends were getting promotions, new cars, new jewelry. She talked about the pressure she felt to keep up, to fit the lifestyle she was surrounded by. Marcus listened, tried to reassure her, tried to remind her of what truly mattered to them. But she heard only what she feared she was missing. The last year of their marriage had felt like a slow unraveling. Not a series of arguments or explosive moments, but a gradual widening of the distance between them. Marcus would come home from work and find her lost in thought, staring at spaces that didn't exist yet, imagining a life she didn't have. He still loved her with all his heart, but he could feel her slipping through his fingers, drawn towards something that seemed brighter only because it was out of reach. The night she left, she had been gentle about it. That, somehow, made it hurt even more. She sat on the edge of the couch, with her hands folded together, choosing her words carefully. She said she cared for him deeply, but she felt like she was standing still. She wanted more than what they could build together at the rate things were going. She needed a life that matched her ambition. She said she didn't want to look back one day and wonder what she could have had if she hadn't settled. Marcus listened quietly, even as her words pierced him in ways he didn't show. When she finished, he nodded, stood, walked to the door, and opened it for her. He didn't beg her to stay. He didn't argue or make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He simply said he wanted her to be happy. She hesitated long enough for him to think maybe she would change her mind, but then she kissed his cheek and walked out. That had been nearly 8 months ago. Marcus learned to live alone again. He rebuilt routines, filled his weekends with small tasks that kept his mind busy, spent more time with his older sister and her kids. People around him thought he was healing well, and in some ways he was. But there were nights when he lay awake wondering what he could have done differently, what he could have said that might have made her stay. He missed her laugh, the way she curled up beside him, the dreams they once shared. Yet he knew she had made her choice, and he respected it even though it broke something inside him. He hadn't heard from her since. Not once. She had moved into a different circle now, one filled with people who had more money, more shine, more of everything she believed she needed. He tried not to follow glimpses of her life online, but sometimes a photo would surface through mutual friends. Maya dressed in a stylish outfit at a rooftop lounge. Maya smiling beside someone with a designer watch and a perfect smile. Maya living the life she thought she wanted. Marcus couldn't fault her for pursuing her dreams, but he wished she had trusted him enough to build them together. He wished she had seen the man he was working to become instead of the limitations of his present. But wishing didn't change the past, and he refused to foster bitterness. Even in heartbreak, he held on to the compassion that shaped him. That compassion was something he learned from his grandmother, Lillian Reed, a woman known in their family for her wisdom and her boundless heart. She had raised him and his sister after their mother passed away unexpectedly, giving them everything she could with the little she had. She worked 2 jobs well into her later years, just to keep food on the table and clothes on their backs. She never complained, never faltered, and always told Marcus that his kindness would guide him further in life than anything money could buy. Lillian had been the only person Marcus confided in about the breakup. She listened carefully, holding his hand as he recounted the story. She told him love was never lost if it taught you something meaningful. She reminded him that true value came from character, not wealth. What she didn't tell him was that she carried a secret that would change Marcus's life in ways he couldn't imagine. Because Lillian was not simply the grandmother who raised him in a small Atlanta home. She was also the last surviving connection to a vast business empire founded generations earlier by a branch of their family that split after a complicated inheritance dispute. Most of the world didn't know the details, and Lillian had deliberately kept it that way. She believed that protecting Marcus from the weight of that legacy was the best way to allow him to grow into the man he needed to be. She had decided long ago that he would learn the truth when he was ready, not when others expected something from him. She had spent years preparing documents, arranging trusts, and speaking quietly with advisors about the transition of assets that had remained dormant but incredibly valuable. The empire included land holdings, technology investments, patents, and long-term assets that had multiplied several times over. The valuation had been confirmed again and again, the number growing each year until it reached a point almost surreal to comprehend. Nearly $50 billion. Marcus had no idea any of this existed. He still drove an aging car that sputtered on cold mornings. He still packed lunches from home to save money. He still lived with the belief that hard work was his pathway to stability, not realizing that a life-altering legacy waited quietly just beyond his awareness. Lillian had hoped to tell him herself one day, but age had caught up with her more quickly than she expected. Her health began to fail, and she moved into a care facility where Marcus visited her every week. He brought her flowers, told her stories from work, and pushed her wheelchair around the garden as she smiled, soaking up the world she had always cherished. He never noticed how her eyes softened each time she looked at him, how she seemed to be memorizing the lines of his face. He didn't know she had already instructed her attorneys to finalize everything, to ensure that when the moment came, Marcus would receive the wealth, the companies, the power, and the responsibility tied to a dynasty hidden in plain sight. She believed he would lead with the same compassion she had nurtured in him. As the rain eased outside his window, Marcus checked the time and realized it was nearly 7. He grabbed his jacket, pulled up the hood, and stepped into the night. It was his evening to visit Lillian, and he never missed a visit. No matter how busy work became, no matter how tired he was, he showed up for her the way she had always shown up for him. The care facility was only a 15-minute walk, and he preferred the quiet route through the tree-lined neighborhood streets. He didn't know that tonight would begin a shift in his life that would touch every corner of the world he knew. For now, he simply walked, letting the cool air clear his thoughts. As he passed under a street lamp, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He assumed it was a text from his sister, asking if he could help watch the kids this weekend. But when he checked the screen, he saw a message from an unfamiliar number, one that carried a tone far more formal than he was used to receiving. "Mr. Reed, please call us as soon as possible. This is regarding urgent matters concerning your grandmother, Lillian Reed." His heart tightened as he picked up his pace. He tried calling the facility, but the line went unanswered twice before someone picked up. The nurse on the other end sounded strained as she told him to come immediately. They didn't give more details, only that it was important. The walk that normally felt peaceful now felt endless. He crossed the final intersection just as the clouds parted slightly, revealing a faint glow of moonlight. When he reached the facility doors, he pushed inside, his breath uneven from the rush. A nurse guided him down the hall to a private room where 2 people in suits waited beside a hospital administrator. One of them held a folder with documents clipped inside. The administrator looked at Marcus with sympathy, but the 2 visitors studied him with an intensity that made him uneasy. He didn't know it yet, but in a matter of minutes, his understanding of his life, his past, his future, his worth, would change forever. And in another part of the city, Maya would soon be confronted with a reality she could never have predicted, one that would force her to face every choice she had made, including the one that broke the man she once said she loved. The night was only beginning to reveal the threads that would pull all of their lives together in ways none of them saw coming. The air inside the quiet room felt heavy as Marcus stepped forward, unsure of what he was about to hear. The 2 people in suits introduced themselves as legal representatives for a private trust, but the administrator motioned him toward the bed before they continued. His grandmother lay resting with her eyes closed, her breathing thin but steady. He reached for her hand, feeling its familiar warmth even as worry pressed sharply against his chest. The administrator assured him she was stable, but had experienced a sudden decline earlier that evening. His visits always comforted her, they said. They hoped tonight would do the same. The representatives waited silently by the window until the administrator stepped out, leaving them alone. Marcus smoothed the blanket at the edge of the bed, trying to collect himself before turning to the strangers who had summoned him. There was something in their posture, something careful and calculated, as if they were preparing to speak words that would alter the room. The older representative began by offering condolences for the scare, though he phrased it in a way that unnerved Marcus, as if he were anticipating a different outcome soon. Then he opened the folder in his hands. He explained that they were acting on behalf of entities connected to his grandmother, and that there were matters requiring immediate discussion. Marcus listened politely, though confusion pulled at him with each sentence. He assumed at first that it was about medical decisions or paperwork he needed to sign. But as the representative outlined a history he had never known existed, the truth slowly emerged like a shadow taking form. He heard the words asset distribution, legacy transition, beneficiaries, controlling interest, and valuation reports. He heard numbers he had only ever seen in news headlines about the world's wealthiest families. Numbers so large they barely registered as real, more like symbols than currency. He felt himself drifting from one emotion to another. Disbelief, confusion, the instinct to laugh because none of this could possibly be about him. They explained that his grandmother had spent decades quietly ensuring that certain properties, businesses, and holdings were protected under her branch of the family's name. They explained she was the final living link to a fortune that had grown across generations. They showed him documents, signatures, statements. They emphasized that his grandmother intended for him to inherit full control, but that she had wished to tell him personally, a wish that time might no longer allow. When the representative said the number aloud, the air seemed to still in Marcus's lungs. $50 billion. He stared at them, unable to form a response. The rain outside tapped faintly against the window again, but everything else fell away. He wanted to say they had the wrong person. He wanted to insist he had no claim to anything like that. He wanted to argue that his grandmother worked 2 jobs and lived modestly, never giving the slightest impression that she held a secret of such magnitude. But the documents were real. The signatures were hers. And the representatives looked at him with the steady expressions of people who had delivered shocking news more than once in their careers. His grandmother's breathing softened. He squeezed her hand gently, wishing she would open her eyes and tell him this was all some strange misunderstanding. Instead, her eyelids fluttered in a faint attempt to wake. She whispered his name, her voice barely audible, but the recognition in it anchored him. He bent closer and told her he was there, that everything was okay. She gave the smallest nod before drifting back into sleep. He stayed beside her until the nurses returned to check her vitals, and only then did he step into the hallway with the representatives to continue the conversation. They walked him to a private conference room. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as they explained the next steps, the legal procedures, the expectations tied to the inheritance. They spoke about board members and corporate structures, about assets resting in multiple states, multiple industries, multiple generations of growth. They spoke of confidentiality, emphasizing that news of this scale could not reach the public prematurely. They spoke of a timeline, subtle but urgent, and Marcus listened, his mind struggling to keep pace with the avalanche of information. He had lived 34 years, believing he understood his place in the world. Now that understanding trembled on unstable ground. After an hour, they handed him their cards and told him someone would reach out tomorrow with further instructions. They reminded him that everything his grandmother had built, protected, and hidden was now preparing to shift into his hands. He nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully grasped what that meant. He returned to his grandmother's bedside once more before leaving. She slept quietly, her face relaxed in a way that eased some of his fear. He whispered that he loved her, kissed her forehead, and promised he would come back in the morning. Then he stepped into the cool night air. As he walked home, his thoughts spun faster than his steps could match. His world had been humble, predictable. Now the boundaries of it felt distorted. He wondered what his grandmother had sacrificed to protect such a vast legacy, what burdens she had chosen not to share with him, what expectations she believed he could rise to meet. He imagined her younger, fighting battles he would never fully know, guarding something not for herself, but for the future she envisioned for him. A future he had never seen coming. The enormity of it pressed against his chest, not in a way that frightened him, but in a way that made him feel the weight of her trust. But even as he tried to process what lay ahead, another thought pulled quietly into focus. Maya. Her absence had shaped his days for months, but tonight, thinking of her carried a different sort of ache. Not longing, not anger, but something layered beneath both. She had left him because she believed he could never give her the life she wanted. She had chosen a world of outward success over the life they had shared. Now, without knowing it, she had walked away from something far beyond even her most ambitious dreams. Marcus didn't dwell on revenge or vindication. He felt only a widening distance between the man she thought he was and the man he was learning he could become. If she ever learned the truth, he wondered how she would feel. Would she regret what she walked away from? Would she see that she misjudged him? Would she reconsider the meaning of the happiness she chased? But he pushed those questions aside. Tonight was not about her. It was about the sudden turning of his life toward a path he had never imagined he'd stand on. Still, her memory lingered like a quiet echo, reminding him of the fragility of assumptions and the cost of choices made in haste. When he reached his apartment, he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the space that had always felt like a modest refuge. The paint was worn in places. The furniture was second-hand. The carpet had stubborn stains he never managed to wash out. It was where he had lived small, lived simply, lived with a broken heart slowly mending. Now he looked at it with a different awareness. Soon, this room would be part of a world he was leaving behind. Not because he wanted extravagance, but because responsibilities of this scale required a different life. Decisions that affected thousands of employees, properties across states, and contracts worth more than he had ever seen meant stepping into a realm where he would need guidance, training, and a steady composure he wasn't sure he possessed yet. He slept poorly that night, waking every hour with new questions pressing against him. What kind of man did he need to become to honor what his grandmother trusted him with? How would he adjust? Who could he confide in? His sister deserved to know at some point, but not yet. Not until he was certain he understood the implications. He finally drifted into a deeper sleep just after dawn, only to wake again an hour later to the sound of his phone vibrating. It was one of the representatives from the night before, requesting a meeting downtown. He arrived in his usual work clothes, a plain button-down shirt, pressed slacks, and shoes he had owned for 6 years. The office building was sleek and mirrored, towering over the street like a monument to a world he had never been part of. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and subtle lighting. A woman at the front desk checked his name and led him up to a private floor. The representatives greeted him with polite smiles and guided him into a conference room even more polished than the one at the care facility. They began by explaining the history of the Reed family's holdings. Decades ago, the empire had been consolidated, but then fractured by internal disputes. His grandmother had chosen distance rather than conflict, quietly maintaining her portion of the assets. Over the years, her fraction grew exponentially due to wise investments, strategic partnerships, and the compounding value of properties tied to industries that expanded rapidly in the late 20th century. They showed him maps, charts, graphs. They showed him records proving she had been preparing for this transition since long before he was born. As they spoke, Marcus realized how little he had truly known about her life before she raised him. She had been strong, resourceful, and steady, but he had never imagined she achieved any of this. She had always chosen simplicity, teaching him through action that dignity did not rely on wealth. She had hidden her power so he could grow without the shadow of expectation. And now she was handing him everything. He asked the representatives why she never said anything. They answered gently. She believed timing mattered more than knowledge. She believed he needed to be shaped by humility first. She believed he would steward the empire differently from those who saw money as a shortcut to worth. They gave him a preliminary binder detailing the first wave of responsibilities he would assume once the legal transition began. There were boards to meet, executives to evaluate, auditors to consult, agreements to sign. They spoke of teams already assembled to guide him through the process. They also explained the risks: media exposure, opportunistic parties, individuals who might seek to exploit his inexperience. They emphasized confidentiality again, urging him to be cautious. The inheritance was not just wealth, it was influence. Influence that could shift markets, open political doors, and draw attention from circles he had never even heard of. As he processed this, they informed him that certain corporate leaders had already been notified of his pending role, though anonymously for now. They were preparing for his official introduction once his grandmother's condition stabilized or after other decisions were made if necessary. He swallowed hard at that. He didn't want power. He didn't crave status. But he understood responsibility, and he understood loyalty. If his grandmother believed he could do this, he would rise to meet the expectations. When the meeting ended, he left the office feeling as though his life now existed in two planes. The one where he was still Marcus Reed, the quiet engineer from Atlanta, and the one where he would soon become the head of an empire he had never known existed. He walked through the city, letting the noise of traffic drown his thoughts for a moment. He bought a coffee from a small cafe and sat outside under an awning, watching strangers hurry to work. None of them knew who he was or who he would become. He found comfort in that anonymity, knowing it wouldn't last. As he sipped his coffee, he wondered again about Maya. In her pursuit of a life of luxury, she had left him behind without hesitation. He didn't resent her, it wasn't in his nature, but he couldn't help reflecting on how swiftly things could change. The life she believed he couldn't give her was about to become his responsibility. Not something he earned through luck or chance, but through the legacy of a woman who sacrificed everything to protect the future she envisioned for him. He wondered whether Maya would ever cross paths with him again. Atlanta was a large city, but circles often overlapped in unexpected ways. He pictured her smile, the hopes she once whispered, and the disappointment she eventually felt. He imagined her hearing the news someday, realizing what she had walked away from. He didn't desire her pain, but he hoped she would learn something valuable from it, the same way he was learning from the sudden shift in his own fate. Over the next week, Marcus divided his time between his job, his grandmother's bedside, and meetings that introduced him little by little to the vast world he was preparing to enter. His coworkers noticed a change in him. More thoughtful pauses, distracted glances, the sense that something unspoken was pressing on him. But he didn't tell them anything. He moved through each day quietly, absorbing everything, sorting through emotions he barely had time to name. One afternoon, as he walked out of the care facility, he ran into his sister, Monique, who had arrived unexpectedly. She hugged him tightly, sensing the strain in his shoulders. She asked him what was wrong, her eyes narrowing with concern. He wanted to tell her, wanted to share the revelation that had been unfolding around him. But confidentiality wasn't optional, so he simply told her their grandmother's condition had him overwhelmed. She accepted the explanation, but kept studying him, as though she could feel the truth pulsing beneath his restraint. She promised she would help however she could. Her reassurance steadied him. She had always been his partner in weathering difficult times, even when they were children. He promised himself he would tell her everything when the time was right. A few days later, while leaving another meeting downtown, he found himself walking through a neighborhood he rarely visited. He stopped at a small bookstore to pick up something to read to his grandmother. As he browsed the shelves, he heard a familiar voice behind him. It was faint, but unmistakable. He froze. Then he turned slowly, and there she was, Maya, dressed in a sleek cream-colored blouse and fitted trousers, her hair curled perfectly, her makeup subtle but deliberate. She was with a man he didn't recognize, tall, confident, wearing expensive shoes and an even more expensive watch. They were laughing about something as they browsed a display table. For a moment, Marcus stood still, unseen, watching the life she had chosen unfold right in front of him. She looked happy, at least on the surface. She looked comfortable in this world she had long chased. He felt a small ache, but also a strange clarity. He didn't approach her. He didn't want to interrupt or ignite anything unresolved. He quietly moved to a different aisle until they left the store. Only when he was sure they were gone did he step outside again. But as he walked back toward the subway station, a thought settled into him. One that marked the true beginning of the conflict shaping itself in the shadows of his life. It was not about wealth or loss or the sting of what she abandoned. It was the realization that his world and hers would cross again. Not in this bookstore, not by chance, but inevitably because the world he was being pulled into was connected to far more people and places than he could see from his current viewpoint. The empire he would soon lead touched industries tied to many influential groups in Atlanta and beyond, groups that people like Maya and her circle gravitated toward. He didn't know when or how the collision would happen, but he understood now that the life he was entering and the life she was chasing existed closer together than either of them realized. Their separation had not cut the thread between them. It had only stretched it. And sooner or later, something would pull it taut. Days continued to pass, each one layered with new revelations. His grandmother's condition remained fragile but stable. The representatives introduced him to trusted advisors, financial analysts, and key project managers. They walked him through transition plans, corporate histories, and the responsibilities he would assume. He met people who spoke in confident tones about markets, projections, and global strategies. Some looked at him with genuine respect. Others regarded him with doubt, unsure if a quiet engineer from Atlanta could possibly understand the magnitude of what lay ahead. Their skepticism didn't insult him. If anything, it fueled a quiet resolve to prove himself. One evening, while reviewing documents in his apartment, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number he did recognize, a mutual friend shared with Maya. He hesitated before answering. The friend sounded tense, unsure if she should even be calling. She explained that she had seen Maya recently at an event and that things seemed strained. She mentioned financial pressure, arguments with the man Marcus had seen her with, a sense that things weren't as polished as they appeared on social media. Marcus listened but didn't comment. It wasn't his place to intervene. The friend apologized for bringing it up, but said she thought he should know, especially given how deeply he had cared for her. He thanked her for checking in and ended the call with a swirl of mixed emotions. He didn't feel satisfaction, only a quiet sadness that Maya might be learning difficult lessons the hard way. He wished her well, even from afar. But he also understood that her choices were leading her down a path he could no longer follow. His path was changing too quickly now, too dramatically, and the gap between who he used to be and who he needed to become widened with each passing day. Still, something lingered in the back of his mind, a sense that the choices she had made and the choices he was being thrust toward would soon intersect in ways neither of them expected. He could feel it building, a tension weaving itself through the edges of his life as the pressure of his new reality intensified. The conflict was no longer about heartbreak. It was about identity, responsibility, and the unseen forces pulling him forward. He was no longer a man watching life happen around him. He was stepping into a role that demanded action, demanded clarity, demanded courage. And somewhere on the other side of the city, Maya was walking toward her own collision with the truth, unaware of the storm gathering beneath the surface of the world she longed to join. The threads between their lives were drawing tighter, setting the stage for the rising tensions neither of them could avoid. The world was shifting, and both of them were about to be caught in the momentum of choices past and futures yet to unfold. The early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Marcus's apartment as another week began, the kind of pale gold light that usually signaled a calm start. But calm no longer existed in the same shape it once had for him. His days were no longer measured by shifts at the manufacturing firm or the predictable rhythm of repairing machinery. They were occupied by meetings, briefings, introductions to executives who looked at him with practiced professionalism, and sessions with advisors who spoke in terms of futures, projections, and long-range planning. Every hour added new layers to the life he was stepping into. Every conversation pulled him further from the familiar and deeper into the unfamiliar terrain of leadership and expectation. He sat at his small kitchen table, staring at a binder filled with updates he needed to review before his morning meeting. The binder felt heavier than it should, as though the gravity of its contents extended beyond its physical weight. He rubbed his forehead, remembering again how only a few weeks earlier he had walked these same floors with no knowledge of what lay beneath the surface of his family's past. The world around him still felt the same, but everything inside him had begun to shift. He didn't resent the change. If anything, he felt a growing sense of duty forming in the center of himself, a quiet but steady force that reassured him that his grandmother's trust was not misplaced. But that didn't mean he didn't feel overwhelmed. He was adjusting quickly, reading late into the night, absorbing every detail he could, showing up prepared even when exhaustion shadowed him. People began noticing his natural calm during discussions. They seemed surprised by how quickly he grasped concepts. Those who doubted him at first became more cautious in their assumptions. He didn't demand respect. He simply earned it with steady presence and sharp attention. But at the same time, something else was growing, a sense that certain tensions were building around him. Small details that didn't fit began to catch his eye. A pause between two executives during a meeting that felt too heavy with meaning. A few murmurs among advisors when they thought he wasn't listening. A brief mention of a business rival who had long sought to gain ownership of certain assets under his family's name. The empire he was inheriting was not built in a vacuum. It existed in an environment where powerful people moved with intent, ambition, and sometimes quiet rivalry. He didn't understand the full picture yet, but he could feel its edges pressing closer. The rising pressure demanded that he begin seeing the world not just as an engineer who solved practical problems, but as a successor to something far larger. A leader who needed to recognize danger before it arrived. A guardian of something his grandmother had spent decades protecting from the wrong hands. His grandmother's condition stabilized, but left her unable to speak for long periods. She drifted in and out of awareness, offering small smiles or soft squeezes of his hand during visits. The nurses told him she was fighting, but the unpredictable nature of her health meant each day carried its own uncertainty. He desperately wished to hear her voice again, to ask her questions only she could answer, to learn from her directly about the path he was stepping into. But she rested quietly, her eyes conveying a comfort that words could not. Every time he visited her, he felt strengthened by her presence, even in silence. One afternoon, as he sat in a meeting reviewing strategic partnerships, he noticed his phone vibrating repeatedly in his pocket. He ignored it at first, assuming it was a scheduling reminder or a message from his sister. But when it buzzed a third time within seconds, he glanced down discreetly and saw the name of one of the trust representatives. He excused himself from the room, stepping out into the hallway. The representative's tone was urgent. There was a development involving a long-standing business interest, one not previously discussed in detail because it had been dormant for years. But now someone was attempting to reactivate it, and not just anyone. A competing group with a complicated history tied to the inheritance dispute from decades earlier. They believed they could challenge the ownership transition, exploiting a loophole they likely thought still existed. Marcus listened, his heartbeat accelerating. He barely knew the structure of the empire, let alone the history of old conflicts. Yet now he was being pulled into them. The representative assured him that their legal teams were already mobilizing, but they needed his input for certain decisions. They would brief him fully that evening. He returned to the meeting room, his expression composed, but his mind restless. If this was happening now, before he was even officially introduced as the heir, what would happen once the world learned who he was? What forces would gather then? He took his seat again, listening as the conversation resumed, but his thoughts drifted to the weight of the legacy he was inheriting. He had thought the biggest challenge would be learning how to lead. He hadn't yet considered what it meant to defend. After work, he made his way to the care facility to visit his grandmother before the evening briefing. She was awake when he arrived, her eyes soft and warm when she saw him. He pulled his chair close to the bed and held her hand. She squeezed his fingers faintly. He wished he could tell her everything, ask her where he should begin, how he should move forward. He wondered whether she was aware of what was unfolding, whether she sensed the shifting currents around her. She lifted her hand slightly, brushing his cheek with a gesture that carried reassurance even in silence. He leaned into her touch, feeling a surge of emotion stir in his chest. He whispered that he would take care of things. He would do what she hoped he could. Her hand rested against his cheek for a moment longer before settling back onto the blanket. The evening briefing deepened his understanding of the challenge ahead. The dormant business interest involved a set of patents tied to an old technology that had recently become relevant again due to new industry advancements. Whoever controlled those patents would gain leverage in multiple sectors. Marcus's family's portion of ownership had never been publicly disclosed, but certain rival entities seemed to have discovered enough to attempt a confrontation. The representatives explained that the rival group was contacting intermediaries, filing exploratory documents, and positioning themselves to stake a claim. Though the law and the documented succession plan were in Marcus's favor, the rival group was known for aggressive tactics. They would try to undermine the transition through pressure, doubt, and influence rather than legal merit. Marcus listened quietly, absorbing the strategy discussions, the countermeasures, the implications of a potential dispute. He felt the weight settling deeper, but also a growing certainty within himself. He didn't intend to let anyone dismantle what his grandmother had built. He didn't intend to step aside merely because others believed he lacked experience. He asked measured questions, surprising the room with how quickly he understood the situation. He asked what actions they recommended. They explained that his involvement would be necessary for certain key decisions once he was officially recognized. Until then, he had to remain aware and prepared. He nodded, feeling the shift inside him strengthen. As the days continued, the pace accelerated. Meetings multiplied. Documents required his review. Advisors requested his signature on preliminary authorizations. He began studying the structure of each sector of the empire, learning the history, the strengths, the vulnerabilities. He took late-night calls, read through case studies, asked pointed questions during briefings. He learned about the philanthropic branches and the initiatives his grandmother had quietly supported. He discovered how deeply woven her influence had been, not through public recognition, but through deliberate generosity that affected communities and individuals in ways he had never known. Each detail painted her legacy in deeper color. And all the while, somewhere outside the sphere of wealth and influence he was entering, Maya began drifting closer to the edges of his rising story without realizing it. She continued attending events, mingling with individuals who valued surface-level success. But whispers about a massive shift in one of the region's most concealed family holdings began circulating among business circles. She heard fragments during a dinner gathering, not names, not specifics, but excitement about an unexpected heir stepping into power. People speculated about who it might be, spinning theories and gossip. Maya listened with interest, but never imagined the conversation had anything to do with someone she once shared a home with. Someone she once kissed good morning before work. Someone she had walked away from because she believed he lacked ambition and the resources to build the future she wanted. But the world she was navigating was directly tied to several industries connected to the empire Marcus was preparing to lead. People she interacted with were making moves, decisions, and plans influenced by the shifting ownership behind the scenes. And gradually, even before Marcus's name became public, she began noticing subtle changes in the behavior of some of the people she socialized with. A few became more guarded, their conversations more strategic. Others discussed new opportunities, deals, and partnerships that felt unusually vibrant. She recognized ambition in their eyes, ambition she once believed she needed to chase by leaving Marcus. But she also sensed a growing pressure, unspoken tensions beneath the glossy surface of luxury gatherings. Meanwhile, Marcus's transformation continued. He stopped taking the bus to meetings and began using discreet transportation arranged by the representatives, not out of vanity, but because security concerns surfaced once the rival group intensified their efforts. The representatives taught him how to identify signs of corporate probing, how to interpret indirect moves made through intermediaries, how to respond without revealing vulnerability. They encouraged him to cultivate confidence in settings where powerful people tested boundaries. He absorbed everything, storing each lesson in places he could access instinctively when needed. His sister Monique noticed the change too. She visited him one Saturday morning to drop off homemade breakfast. She took one look at the binders stacked on his table, the documents neatly organized in color-coded folders, the notes he had written in tidy handwriting across dozens of pages. She raised an eyebrow, asking if he had taken on some kind of major project. He hesitated, torn between the obligation to remain quiet and the wish to include her in the world he was joining. He told her there were things happening he wasn't allowed to explain yet, but that one day, soon she would understand. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She trusted him without needing details. She hugged him before leaving, telling him she was proud of him. Those words bolstered him more than she realized. A few days later, he attended a private strategy session with several newly introduced board members. They assessed his capacity, not by openly questioning him, but by watching how he responded to complexity, how he processed information under pressure, how he carried himself in a room full of people accustomed to dominance. Some seemed impressed, others doubtful. But one board member, an older woman with keen eyes and a calm presence, watched him with a fascination that felt almost protective. After the meeting, she asked him to stay behind. She told him she had known his grandmother in their younger years. She described her as brilliant, sharp, and deeply committed to fairness. She told him that his grandmother had foreseen many challenges he would face and had taken careful steps to ensure he would not walk unprepared. She said she recognized traces of Lillian in him, his composure, his quiet observation, the strength in his patience. Her words steadied him. She warned him too. The path ahead would not be simple. People who once dismissed the Reed family's influence would re-emerge, seeking favor or advantage. He needed to discern intentions, especially from those who smiled easily. He thanked her, appreciating the honesty. The next turning point arrived unexpectedly one late afternoon as he was leaving the main office building after a long meeting about restructuring one of the philanthropic arms. He stepped into the lobby, exhausted but focused, when someone called his name, a voice he hadn't heard in months but recognized immediately. He froze before turning around. There, near the entrance, stood Maya. She looked polished but tired, as though the shine she usually carried had dulled slightly around the edges. She hadn't expected to see him there. That much was clear in her expression. She approached him slowly, uncertainty mingling with something softer in her gaze. He didn't know what to say. But she spoke first, her tone composed but fragile. She told him she needed to talk. There were things she wanted to say, things she hadn't understood before, things she hoped he might hear. He didn't respond immediately. He simply studied her, noting the subtle changes in her posture, the slight tremble in her voice. She wasn't meeting him from a place of confidence. She was meeting him from a place of reckoning. After a quiet pause, he agreed to speak with her, briefly. They stepped outside onto the sidewalk. She began by apologizing, though the word felt inadequate for the depth of what she was trying to express. She said leaving him had been one of the hardest decisions she had ever made, but she had convinced herself it was necessary. She admitted she had been driven by fear of falling behind, fear of living a life she believed lacked success, fear of disappointing expectations she had absorbed from her upbringing. She said she had thought she understood what happiness required, but lately she had begun questioning everything. Marcus listened quietly, not offering absolution, not offering judgment. She continued, explaining that the man she had been seeing was not the partner she imagined he would be. She described arguments, instability, pressures that erupted behind the scenes of their polished appearance. She said she had realized too late that she had traded steady love for something far more fragile. Then she looked at him with a vulnerability he had not seen since they were together. She asked if he could ever forgive her, if they could talk more sometime, if there was any path forward for them. He felt a deep shift inside himself as she spoke. Once her words could have broken him open. Once he had dreamed of hearing her say these things. But now, standing on the threshold of a world she knew nothing about, he understood that something fundamental had changed. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel longing. He felt something steadier. Compassion, yes, but also clarity. He told her he appreciated her honesty, and that he hoped she found the understanding she sought. But he also told her that his life was changing in ways he couldn't explain yet. He wasn't the man she left, and she wasn't the woman he once chased. He wished her well, then stepped back. She looked stunned, not expecting the distance in his tone. She whispered his name, reaching for something already slipping from her grasp. But he gave a gentle shake of his head and walked away. He didn't see her exhale shakily as he left. He didn't see the way her eyes followed him with a mixture of regret and realization. He didn't see her wonder what forces had shaped the new strength in his posture. But the moment marked a new turning point, one that would ripple through both their lives. As his steps carried him down the sidewalk, he realized the rising action of his life had reached a new intensity. The rivalry for control of the dormant business interest grew stronger each day. The pressure from advisors increased as negotiations approached a critical point. Board members began urging him to prepare for public introduction. Tensions escalated behind the scenes as the rival group attempted to secure influence through strategic alliances. Each move they made seemed more deliberate, more pointed. Through it all, Marcus remained centered. He threw himself into preparation, learning, analyzing, making decisions with a balance of heart and strategy. He visited his grandmother every night, drawing strength from her presence. He kept his sister close, spending afternoons playing with her kids when he could, grounding himself in the simplicity of family bonds. But the quiet world he cherished was slowly slipping behind him as the larger forces surrounding the empire grew more intense. The rival group began making bold moves, filing formal challenges, sending intermediaries to question the transition, even contacting individuals connected to the company's past in an attempt to stir unrest. Marcus found himself reviewing legal documents late into the night, strategizing with advisors about how to counter each maneuver without revealing uncertainty. The tension grew more complex when he learned that one of the rival group's key supporters was someone deeply connected to the social circles Maya had been frequenting. Her world and his were drawing closer again, not through emotion but through circumstance. He wondered whether she would hear his name soon, whether she would discover the truth not from him but from the world around them. But he didn't let himself dwell on her. There was too much at stake now. He focused on the empire, on the legacy, on the quiet determination that had begun taking shape in him. He attended private strategy sessions, advised on charitable initiatives, and met with economic analysts who explained how each decision he made could ripple across markets. He absorbed everything with a steady gaze, surprising even himself with how naturally he adapted. Advisors who had once questioned him now began trusting him, even relying on him. One commented privately that he possessed an instinct they had only seen in leaders shaped by both struggle and integrity. The rivalry escalated swiftly. A major filing from the opposing group demanded immediate response. The legal team assembled overnight, preparing a detailed counter-argument. Marcus reviewed it with them, asking questions that demonstrated not just comprehension, but intuition. When the team finalized their response, they looked at him with respect. One lawyer remarked quietly that his grandmother would be proud. The words struck deep. Meanwhile, whispers about the mysterious heir began spreading through higher business circles. Though his name was not yet public, speculation intensified. Maya heard pieces of the story at another event. Her curiosity piqued, but her heart unsettled as she thought of Marcus's transformation in the lobby that day. She wondered if it could possibly be connected to him, but she quickly dismissed the idea. She convinced herself she simply missed him and was imagining connections that didn't exist. But the doubt lingered in her chest. The stage was gradually aligning itself for a moment that would force all hidden tensions into the open. The rival group gained ground in one maneuver only to lose it in another. Marcus's influence grew quietly but unmistakably within the internal operations. Advisors began positioning him for an appearance at a major upcoming summit, where leaders from multiple sectors would gather. It would be the first time he would step into a room where the full weight of the empire's influence was visible. The world was shifting into place, each choice refining him, each challenge sharpening his resolve. He felt himself being pulled toward a point he could sense but not yet see clearly. A point where everything would converge. The inheritance, the rivalry, the truths long buried, the faces from his past and future. The tension grew around him like a tightening coil, preparing for the moment when stillness would break. He didn't know that the decisions he would soon make would ignite the clash that marked the climax of everything his grandmother protected, everything he had endured, and everything he was becoming. The rising action had carried him far from the quiet man he once was, and the summit ahead would bring the turning point he could no longer avoid. The morning of the summit arrived with a quiet tension that settled over the city like a thin veil. Atlanta's skyline rose against a cloudless sky, the streets below humming with early commuters and vendors unlocking their storefronts. But inside Marcus's apartment, the day felt different. He stood before the mirror adjusting the sleeves of his suit, the one tailored for him earlier that week. It was his first tailored suit, subtle, dignified, nothing loud or extravagant. The representatives had urged him to choose something more striking, something that signaled power. But he chose simplicity, a reflection of the man he was before all of this began, and the man he intended to remain beneath the layers of wealth and responsibility. He closed the top button of his shirt and studied his reflection. The man staring back was familiar, yet changed. His posture straightened naturally now, shaped by countless meetings and the steady pressure to appear assured, even when uncertainty tugged at him. His expression carried a depth that had formed in the weeks since he first learned the truth of his inheritance. He didn't see intimidation in his eyes. He saw focus. He grabbed his documents and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. A car from the trust waited for him downstairs, its engine humming softly. As he slid into the back seat, the driver greeted him with a respectful nod. He returned it with a quiet acknowledgement, settling into the leather interior as the city streets drifted past the windows. As they approached the summit venue, he saw the building's sleek glass exterior, reflecting sunlight in sharp angles. It looked less like a business center and more like a monument to influence. A collection of industries, leaders, and decision-makers from across the region were gathering there today. And for the first time, Marcus would stand among them not as an observer, but as a recognized decision-bearer, though the public still did not know the full extent of who he was. Today's appearance was carefully crafted. He would be introduced not yet as head of the empire, but as a central figure stepping into leadership roles previously occupied by his grandmother. It was a precursor, a shift that would be finalized soon. But within the upper circles, word had already spread. Eyes would be watching closely. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere buzzing with conversations, cameras, and polished professionalism, Marcus walked with measured steps. The representatives flanked him subtly, offering guidance through murmured directions. He signed in, accepted a name badge, and continued toward the first conference hall. Several people turned as he passed, studying him with speculative expressions. Some nodded politely. Others whispered to one another, trying to connect the details they had heard in circulating rumors. He felt the weight of their attention, but it didn't shake him. His grandmother's quiet presence stayed with him like a steady hand resting on his shoulder. Her lessons shaped his composure. Her belief shaped his courage. The first hour unfolded in introductions and networking rounds. Marcus exchanged greetings, fielded questions, and listened closely as participants discussed market conditions, technological advancements, and philanthropic initiatives. He contributed when necessary, his measured voice surprising some with its clarity and confidence. One executive leaned toward another, whispering something that caused them both to glance in his direction with newfound interest. If they were expecting someone inexperienced, they were quickly correcting their assumptions. But beneath the regulated surface of the summit, a different kind of tension churned. The rival group, who had been escalating their efforts to contest the dormant business interest, were present. They stood gathered in polished clusters across the room, their eyes sharp, their conversations low and strategic. One of their lead representatives, a man named Alistair Grant, noticed Marcus almost immediately. Alistair was tall, impeccably dressed, with an expression that carried an undercurrent of superiority. He whispered something to an associate before stepping toward Marcus. The representatives at Marcus's side stiffened slightly, but Marcus lifted a hand to show he would handle this. Alistair approached with a smile too thin to be genuine. He extended a handshake that Marcus accepted, though he felt the underlying challenge in the man's grip. "We haven't officially met," Alistair said, "but I've been hearing quite a bit about you. Marcus Reed, is it?" "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "And you are?" "Someone who prefers working with people who fully understand the magnitude of the world they're entering," Alistair said, letting the words linger with a subtle condescension. "I imagine all of this," he gestured around them, "must feel like quite the adjustment." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "Growth is an adjustment," he said, "but I'm learning quickly." Alistair's eyebrow lifted. "I hope so. There are complex dynamics at play right now, and stepping into leadership without the proper foundation can create unintended consequences. Some might even say, it's unwise." It was a veiled threat, delivered with the poise of someone who had navigated many power struggles. The representatives beside Marcus shifted forward slightly, prepared to intervene, but Marcus remained steady. "I appreciate the concern," Marcus said, "but I trust the foundation my grandmother built, and I trust the people guiding me." Alistair's smile thinned further. "Time will tell whether trust is enough." He leaned in subtly. "You're inheriting more than you understand, and when the moment comes, You may find that certain responsibilities are beyond your reach. Marcus didn't flinch. Then I'll learn to reach them. Alistair studied him for a moment, perhaps expecting hesitation or uncertainty, but finding neither. After a brief pause, he offered a curt nod and stepped away. His associates murmured among themselves, glancing back at Marcus with expressions that mixed irritation and calculation. The encounter didn't shake Marcus, but it confirmed something. This summit was not simply a gathering. It was a field where competing interests moved their pieces, where influence shifted in subtle but powerful currents, and he was a piece they intended to test. The morning sessions progressed, each hour tightening the unseen knots forming between factions. Marcus participated in a panel discussion about technological innovation. His calm contributions earned quiet respect from the audience. After the panel, several people approached him with interest. Executives, analysts, philanthropists. They asked about his perspectives, his background, his plans. He answered thoughtfully, never revealing more than he was ready to share. But his presence alone altered the energy in the room. People began recognizing that he was not merely an emerging leader. He was stepping into something far more substantial. During a short break, he stepped into a quieter hallway to clear his thoughts. He pulled out his phone instinctively, not to check messages, but to look at a photo of his grandmother smiling at a family cookout years ago. Her joy in that photo grounded him. It reminded him of the reason he was here, not for prestige, not for power, but to honor what she had built with sacrifice and devotion. A voice startled him gently. "Marcus?" He turned to find the older board member who had spoken to him after the previous meeting, the one who had been close to his grandmother. Her expression held warmth but shadowed concern. "I've been looking for you," she said. "There's something you need to know." He followed her to a small lounge away from the crowded halls. She closed the door behind them. "The rival group's moves are accelerating faster than we anticipated," she said, lowering her voice. "They've managed to influence 2 of the smaller board members who were once neutral. They've also obtained internal documents from decades ago, likely from someone who shouldn't have had access. They're building a narrative to challenge the legitimacy of your transition." He felt a steady tension rise in his chest, but he kept his voice even. "How strong is their position?" "Legally weak," she replied. "But perception can undermine even solid truth if left unchecked. They're hoping to create enough confusion and internal division that the transition stalls." He nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. "There's more," she added. "Their lead representative, Alistair, plans to question your readiness publicly during the closed-door leadership session this afternoon. It's a strategic move to test your composure, to force you into a defensive posture." "Then I'll stay composed," Marcus said. Her eyes softened with something like pride. "I believe you will. But understand, what happens in that room will shape the path ahead. Many here support you quietly. They want to see how you handle pressure." Marcus straightened slightly. "I'll be ready." She touched his shoulder gently before leaving, and he stood alone for a moment, letting her words settle. The summit had become more than an introduction. It was a turning point, a test shaped not by chance but by intention. He exhaled, steadying his breath. He could feel something shifting within him, a strength rising from the quiet places of his heart, molded by everything he had learned, endured, and carried. The leadership session began in a restricted conference room filled with executives, board members, analysts, and top-level advisors. The doors closed, creating an insulated chamber of influence. Marcus took his seat near the center, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes assessing him. Alistair sat across the room, his posture confident, his smile faint but sharp. The session opened with reports on market trends, philanthropic updates, and expansion strategies. Marcus listened attentively, occasionally making notes. Then came the agenda item the older board member had warned him about. A moderator introduced the topic of leadership transition, acknowledging the anticipated shift as Lillian Reed's health continued to decline. Several participants spoke on the importance of stability, continuity, and preparing for the future. Their words were respectful, but beneath them lay anticipation. The room waited for the moment they all knew was coming. Alistair raised his hand smoothly, and the moderator acknowledged him. He stood slowly, offering a polite smile before speaking. "I would like to address a concern that I believe many in this room may share, even if quietly," he began. "We are entering a pivotal moment in this organization's history. Decisions made in the coming months will shape not only our internal structure, but our influence across multiple industries. With such gravity at hand, it's essential, necessary, to question whether the individual stepping into leadership is adequately prepared." A hush spread across the room. Alistair continued. "Mr. Reed," he said, turning his gaze to Marcus, "is, by all accounts, an intelligent and respectable man. But intelligence alone does not guarantee the capacity to command an empire of this magnitude. He has no history in corporate leadership, no proven experience managing large-scale assets, no background navigating high-stakes negotiations." He clasped his hands in front of him. "I believe it is reasonable to ask whether this transition is being rushed, whether we are risking destabilization by placing an untested individual into a position that requires seasoned expertise." His words were measured, but their intent was clear. Undermine Marcus publicly, sow doubt, force him into defensiveness. A few murmurs rose around the room. Some board members shifted uneasily. Others folded their arms, waiting for Marcus's response. Marcus felt the pressure, but it didn't crush him. He waited until the room settled before standing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. His expression remained calm, his tone steady. "I appreciate the concerns," he said. "Truly, no one understands my lack of experience more than I do. But leadership is not defined by walking into a role with every skill already mastered. It's defined by the willingness to learn, the humility to seek guidance, and the strength to make decisions aligned with integrity." He paused, meeting several gazes around the room. "My grandmother didn't choose me because I was seasoned. She chose me because she believed I could become the leader this organization needs. She knew I would respect the legacy she built while preparing it for the future. She also surrounded me with advisors who have dedicated their lives to this empire. Together, we form a team, not a single point of failure." Some people nodded subtly. Alistair's jaw tightened. Marcus continued, "What I lack in experience, I make up for in commitment. Commitment to learning, to listening, to leading with a sense of responsibility rather than entitlement. I don't claim to be perfect. I claim to be prepared to grow and to absorb everything required to honor this organization." A board member leaned forward, intrigued. "And finally," Marcus added, "whatever doubts exist will be answered not by arguments today, but by the decisions and actions I take moving forward. I'm not here to prove myself through words alone. I'm here to do the work." The room went silent. His words hung in the air, clear and grounded. Then, gradually, Subtle nods appeared among several key figures. One of the philanthropic leaders smiled. The older board member across the room looked visibly moved. Even a few skeptics softened slightly, reassessing the man they had initially underestimated. Alistair offered a curt smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A thoughtful speech," he said. "We will see if your actions align with it." Marcus met his gaze without blinking. "You will." The session moved on, but the atmosphere had shifted. Marcus had not only held his ground, he had established himself as someone who would not be pushed aside. Someone who understood the gravity of the role he was stepping into. Someone who could face pressure without losing his foundation. After the session ended, several executives approached him to shake his hand. One said quietly, "If today was your introduction to leadership, you passed." Another added, "Your grandmother chose well." Their support extended further than simple politeness. It signaled alignment. It signaled trust. But not everyone welcomed the shift. Alistair spoke quietly with his associates, their expressions tense. They had hoped Marcus would falter. Instead, he had strengthened his position. Their eyes followed him with a sharper edge now, recalibrating their strategies. A ripple of realization settled over Marcus. Today marked the beginning of the true conflict. Anything before this had been preparation. Now the stakes were rising into full clarity. During lunch, Marcus stepped outside into a quiet courtyard behind the summit building. He needed air. The events of the morning had energized him, but also left him aware of the magnitude of what lay ahead. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the calm wash through him. When he opened them, he noticed movement near the far walkway. A familiar figure stood there. Maya. She wasn't dressed for business but for appearance, wearing a fitted navy dress and delicate jewelry. She wasn't part of the summit. She must have been here for a nearby event. But she had stopped walking, frozen as her eyes landed on him. Her expression shifted from surprise to confusion, then something deeper. She took a step toward him hesitantly. "Marcus?" she called softly. He didn't move at first, unsure what she wanted, but knowing this meeting was not coincidence. Not anymore. Their lives were intersecting because the worlds they now occupied were tied together by forces neither of them controlled. She approached slowly, studying his attire, his posture, the badge clipped to his lapel. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone soft but strained. "I didn't think you worked in places like this." He met her gaze steadily. "A lot has changed." She looked around, taking in the environment, the tailored suit, the confident way people glanced at him from afar. "I can see that," she said. "Are you part of this summit?" "Yes," he replied simply. She swallowed, her eyes flickering with something like disbelief. "How? I mean, what are you doing here?" Before he could answer, the older board member stepped out into the courtyard, saw Marcus, and approached. "Marcus," she said warmly, "they're ready for you in the next session. Take your time, though. We'll wait." She nodded politely to Maya before returning inside. Maya watched her leave, her expression tightening with questions she didn't voice. She turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on? Who are these people?" He didn't answer immediately. She hadn't earned an explanation, not yet, not like this. But he wasn't cruel. "Things in my family shifted recently," he said. "Responsibilities changed. I've been meeting with people to learn what I need to handle moving forward." Her face paled slightly as understanding slowly dawned. She had heard rumors of a hidden heir rising into power. She had heard whispers at gatherings. She had dismissed them. But now, standing in front of him, watching the way others regarded him, seeing the quiet authority in his stance, she began piecing it together. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "are you—" He didn't answer the unspoken question. Instead, he said, "I have to get back inside. Take care of yourself, Maya." He turned and walked toward the building, leaving her rooted to the spot. Her heart pounded with a realization that shook her. She had left him because she believed he had nothing to offer her future. She had believed ambition required severing ties with a moistustufsa, but underestimated. And now she had seen the truth, not in wealth displayed, but in the way others deferred to him, the strength he carried, the transformation shaped by gravity she could barely comprehend. As Marcus stepped back into the summit, he didn't see the way Maya's eyes filled with a blend of regret and stunned recognition. But her reaction was only the beginning. The world would soon learn what she had just begun to understand. The afternoon sessions grew more intense as negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. Advisors delivered updates about new filings from the rival group. A strategy meeting was scheduled for the evening. The pressure mounted hour by hour, pushing Marcus deeper into the heart of the conflict. His composure never slipped. His voice remained steady, his questions precise. He was rising into the role with a depth even he hadn't predicted. But the rival group was not stepping back. They escalated their tactics, preparing a public challenge that could destabilize the succession. They were betting everything on undermining him before he could solidify control. They underestimated the man they were attempting to dismantle. They underestimated the quiet strength shaped by hardship, love, loss, and a grandmother's belief. By the end of the summit's final session, a storm had gathered beneath the polished surface of the organization's corridors. Tensions were poised to break open. Alliances solidified. Strategies sharpened. Paths drawn. The climax had begun unfolding not in a single explosive moment, but in a series of revelations, confrontations, and shifts that set the stage for a decisive turning point. Marcus walked out of the summit with his head held high, aware that everything ahead of him was converging. The apex of the conflict was rising, and beyond it waited choices that would determine not only the future of the empire, but the future of every relationship, every responsibility, every bond connected to it. The transition toward falling action was beginning to take shape, shaped by the force of everything he had endured and everything he was stepping into. The storm was not yet over. The most pivotal moment was still ahead. The days following the summit unfolded with a momentum that pressed against every corner of Marcus's life, carrying him from one crucial meeting to another as the threads of the conflict tightened. The summit had not merely introduced him to the world's gaze, it had shifted the internal balance of the organization. Executives who had once been cautiously neutral now began leaning toward his side, impressed by his composure during Alistair's attempt to undermine him. Others who had doubted him found themselves reconsidering after witnessing his clarity under pressure. But admiration did not replace challenge. It only sharpened the stakes. The rival group escalated their efforts with renewed urgency. They filed a new challenge, this time framing the succession process as potentially unstable due to what they labeled insufficient vetting of Marcus. They circulated private memos, leaked selective information to sow confusion, and began influencing secondary stakeholders in hopes of fracturing the internal unity Marcus had begun building. Their moves were calculated, designed to push him into a corner where he would either falter publicly or be forced into concessions. But Marcus refused to respond with fear. He grew more composed with each passing day, absorbing guidance from seasoned advisors and leaning into the steady presence he had cultivated over years of quiet endurance. He attended early morning briefings, late-night strategy consultations, and midday negotiations that required every ounce of attention and patience he could muster. His mind remained steady even when exhaustion pressed heavily against him, even when the magnitude of the empire's network seemed almost endless. He no longer questioned whether he belonged. He focused instead on leading responsibly, honoring the path his grandmother had set in motion. His grandmother remained stable but unresponsive most days. He visited her each evening before returning home, reading to her softly, or simply sitting beside her as she rested. Her presence grounded him, reminding him of the deeper purpose behind all of this. She had sacrificed so much to protect a future she believed he could carry. Even if she could not speak, her quiet strength lingered in the space between them, guiding him more than words ever could. He wished she could see the man he was becoming. He hoped she somehow already knew. A week after the summit, the representatives notified him of a critical upcoming session, a decisive internal vote that would determine whether the succession process would continue unchallenged, or whether the rival group's objections would be formally entertained. The vote had the power to either solidify his path or delay it indefinitely. Certain board members were still hesitant, caught between loyalty to the organization and caution toward change. The rival group knew this, and they intensified their pressure accordingly. In preparation for the vote, Marcus met privately with several board members who requested clarification on his vision for the future. He spoke with honesty, describing his respect for the company's history, his commitment to stability, and his desire to strengthen philanthropic branches that had shaped communities in ways the public rarely saw. He spoke about honoring his grandmother's legacy while preparing for shifts in modern markets. His sincerity cut through the doubt some had been clinging to. He didn't promise perfection. He promised integrity. One older board member listened quietly before saying, "Your grandmother once told me that true leadership isn't about controlling people. It's about serving the purpose that outlives you." I believed her then. I see it now in you. Her words carried weight, not because they were flattering, but because they affirmed the lineage he was stepping into. Marcus nodded, grateful, though the pressure in his chest reminded him that every endorsement mattered now. Every hesitation did too. Meanwhile, the rival group grew restless. Their influence was slipping as more individuals began shifting toward Marcus. Alistair responded with increased aggression, arranging private meetings with stakeholders, hinting at potential instability under Marcus's leadership, and even approaching individuals tied to secondary business interests. His strategy was not to defeat Marcus with facts, but to drown him in doubt. But the more Alistair pushed, the more others recognized the desperation behind his actions. They began questioning his motives, his methods, and his connections. Some whispered that his group's ambitions were driven by personal gain rather than organizational welfare. Others pointed out the suspicious timing of their filings. Momentum slowly shifted away from them, though not without turbulence. During this intensifying period, Maya found herself drawn repeatedly into circles where Marcus's name surfaced. The rumors were no longer vague. They grew sharper, more detailed, hinting at a hidden heir stepping into a powerful role. One evening, as she attended a dinner hosted by a prominent couple involved in real estate development, she heard someone mention the Reed transition directly. Her breath caught as they spoke of an unexpected successor, A man no one saw coming, and a quiet professional now standing at the center of a major inheritance. Her pulse quickened. She excused herself, stepping into the hallway to steady her breathing. She already suspected the truth after seeing him at the summit, but hearing confirmation from others rattled her. She replayed his presence that afternoon, the way executives deferred to him, the tailored suit that seemed to fit him not only physically, but symbolically, the calm confidence in his posture. She felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The man she left was not the man she had encountered that day, and the man he was becoming was someone she realized she never truly understood. But regret alone couldn't bridge the distance now forming between their paths. She sensed deeply that whatever world he was stepping into no longer had space for the version of her that left him behind. Her thoughts drifted to the future she believed she wanted, the luxury and security she chased. She found herself questioning whether anything she pursued had been built on solid ground, or whether she had simply been running toward a mirage. She sat alone in the hallway for several minutes, trembling with the weight of realization. She whispered a quiet apology meant for him even though he couldn't hear it. But apologies wouldn't untangle what she had broken. She knew that now. Back in Marcus's world, preparations for the succession vote intensified. The night before the vote, he met with the core advisor team for a final briefing. They reviewed expected outcomes, prepared responses to potential challenges, and rehearsed talking points he might need if discussions grew tense. Marcus listened closely, absorbing each detail, but after a while he set the documents aside. He knew the information. He knew the stakes. What he needed now was trust. Trust in himself, trust in his grandmother's vision, trust in the journey that had shaped him. He closed the last binder and told the advisors, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'll handle it." One advisor smiled slightly. "You already are." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of his apartment building. His thoughts spun through memories of childhood moments with his grandmother, of nights spent fixing machinery in dimly lit factories, of quiet dinners with Maya when life had felt simple. He felt nostalgia, sorrow, gratitude, and anticipation woven together. He knew morning would bring a turning point, not the end, but a shift that would define everything that followed. He woke before dawn, showered, dressed carefully, and ate a quiet breakfast. When he arrived at the office building where the vote would take place, tension hung in the air like a charged current. Security was tighter than usual. Executives gathered in small clusters, whispering. Board members arrived with expressions that gave nothing away. Marcus walked through the hall with shoulders squared but relaxed, returning greetings with respectful nods. No matter what happened, he intended to show up fully as himself. The meeting room was arranged in a semicircle, with each board member's seat labeled. Marcus took his designated seat. A large screen displayed the agenda. Everything about the room communicated seriousness and history. The organization had built itself over decades, shaped by leaders who faced storms of their own. Now Marcus sat poised before a storm that would determine whether he could continue the legacy. The meeting began with procedural updates, financial reports, and philanthropic summaries. Then, as the atmosphere tightened, the moderator introduced the succession item. The room straightened collectively, eyes lifted, shoulders squared. This was the moment everyone had come prepared for. The moderator first explained the structure of the vote. Then he opened the floor for discussion. Immediately, Alistair rose from his seat. His expression was calm, but a certain sharpness flickered in his eyes. He launched into a speech about organizational responsibility, ensuring competent leadership, and avoiding destabilization. His arguments were polished, rehearsed, and deliberately framed to sound reasonable. But beneath the gloss, his intent remained clear: to persuade the board that Marcus's transition should be paused or reassessed. He detailed Marcus's lack of corporate background, questioned the pace of the succession process, and implied that the company risked entrusting decades of progress to unproven hands. He insisted on a thorough external audit of leadership readiness. He suggested appointing an interim leader, someone from his own circle, while the process continued. His words stretched on, weaving a picture of caution that masked the ambition beneath it. Marcus listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't shift uncomfortably. He allowed the room to hear Alistair fully, knowing that challenging him prematurely would only fuel his tactics. When Alistair finally concluded, a few board members exchanged glances. Some nodded subtly, others frowned. The room held a charged stillness. The moderator turned to Marcus. "Mr. Reed," he said, "you may respond." Marcus stood, smoothing his suit jacket without haste. He looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes briefly. When he spoke, his voice carried a clarity shaped not by overconfidence but by understanding. "I appreciate the seriousness of this moment," he began. "And I appreciate the concerns raised. This organization deserves a leader who is prepared, thoughtful, and committed to protecting its legacy." He allowed a small pause. "I may not come from a corporate background. I may not fit the mold of what some expected. But I believe leadership is not defined by how much experience someone has before a challenge arrives. It's defined by how they grow to meet that challenge." Several people nodded. "My grandmother built her portion of this empire through perseverance and quiet strength," he continued. "She prepared meticulously for the future, not by choosing someone who already knew everything, but by choosing someone who understood responsibility at its core." His voice deepened slightly. "I'm not here to seek power. I'm here to protect a legacy entrusted to me. I've listened, learned, and surrounded myself with those who have the experience I'm still gaining. I won't pretend to know everything, but I know how to lead with integrity, and I know how to build trust, not through declarations, but through consistent action." He turned toward the board as a whole. "The rival group believes I am unprepared because they misunderstand the foundation I stand on. They believe leadership is measured only in technical expertise, but leadership is also measured in character, in clarity under pressure, in the courage to grow into the role rather than arrive as a completed version of oneself." A soft murmur spread across the room. Not of doubt, but of recognition. He finished quietly. "I am committed to earning my place every day. I ask that you judge me not on my past, but on the work I am ready to do, the legacy I honor, and the future we can build together." He sat down. The room held its breath. Even those who had been uncertain felt something shift. His words had not been flamboyant. They had been rooted in sincerity, shaped by the inner strength he carried from years of living humbly. The moderator called for the vote. One by one, board members cast their decisions. The room remained silent, except for the subtle sound of electronic confirmations. Marcus's heartbeat thudded steadily, though his face remained composed. Alistair leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When the moderator finally looked up at the results, his expression softened. "The board has voted to uphold the succession process without delay." Marcus inhaled a slow breath. It wasn't triumph he felt. It was steadiness, an affirmation that the path forward had not closed. Whispers of reaction rippled around the room. Some smiled quietly, others nodded with respect. Alistair's jaw tightened, disappointment flickering across his face before he masked it. He had expected to weaken Marcus today. Instead, Marcus had strengthened his position. The meeting moved on to other agenda items, but the shift lingered palpably. Marcus did not bask in the outcome. He focused instead on the work ahead. The vote had settled one conflict, but it had not ended the challenges. The rival group would not simply retreat. They would recalibrate, strategize anew, and he would need to be ready. Later that evening, Marcus stepped outside the building into the warm air. The sky had deepened into twilight, the city lights flickering against the darkness. He stood on the sidewalk, breathing in the night, feeling the tension finally ease enough for reflection. The path ahead was still steep, still uncertain, but he no longer doubted his footing. He felt a quiet resolve anchoring him. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the care facility. His grandmother's condition had changed. They advised him to come. His breath caught. He immediately called for transportation and made his way to the facility, the city lights blurring past the windows as a sense of urgency settled over him. Arriving at her room, he found the nurses moving quietly, their expressions gentle but serious. His grandmother lay resting, her breathing softer than before. He sat beside her, taking her hand. For a moment her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, not with fear, but with deep tenderness. Her lips moved faintly. He leaned in. "Proud," she whispered breathlessly. "So proud." Emotion rose thick in his chest. He squeezed her hand gently, resting his forehead against it. She closed her eyes again, her breathing slow but steady. He sat with her for hours, speaking softly about the vote, about his fears, about the strength she had given him. He didn't know if she heard everything, but he hoped she felt the love shaping each word. The world outside continued turning, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding in that small room. The pressures of the organization, the ambitions of the rival group, the regrets stirring in Maya's heart, all waited beyond these walls. The climax of the conflict had passed, but its aftermath was still unfolding. As Marcus sat with his grandmother, he felt the next shift taking shape, the beginning of the falling action leading toward a future he had not yet imagined, a future still filled with challenges, reckonings, and choices he would soon need to face. The resolution was still ahead, but its outline was forming softly in the distance as the night deepened around him. The following morning arrived gently, sunlight slipping past the curtains of the care facility room and casting a muted glow on the walls. Marcus had fallen asleep in the chair beside his grandmother's bed, his hand still wrapped around hers. When he woke, he found her resting peacefully, her breathing slow but even. The nurses moved quietly around them, checking monitors, adjusting blankets, offering nods of understanding when Marcus blinked groggily awake. They didn't need to explain anything. He could feel the nearness of a final chapter settling over them. It wasn't frightening. It felt tender, dignified, like the closing of a life lived with quiet strength. He leaned close and whispered to her about the night before, about how she had given him courage without uttering more than a single word. He told her he would honor everything she fought for, everything she protected for him. She didn't open her eyes, but her fingers curled faintly around his. The gesture was small but carried more meaning than any long speech. she understood. She had always understood. By late afternoon, her breathing shifted, gentler, softer, as though she were drifting through a doorway only she could see. Marcus felt the change instantly. He called the nurse, who came quickly and checked her vitals. She turned to him with a quiet expression that needed no explanation. He sat back down and took his grandmother's hand with both of his. He whispered that she could rest now. He whispered that he would take care of everything. He whispered that he loved her beyond words. When she exhaled her final breath, it slipped into the room like a note of release. Peaceful, complete, free of struggle. Marcus bowed his head, tears warming his palms as they fell. It wasn't the crashing kind of grief he once feared. It was deep, yes, but filled with gratitude. She had raised him with nothing but love, fought for him with nothing but determination, guided him into a future he never expected, and left him with a legacy of strength. He let himself cry, not from despair, but from honoring her life. He stayed with her until the nurses gently asked if he wanted more time, or if they should begin the formal steps. He kissed her forehead, thanked them for their kindness, and stepped into the hallway. The air felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, but he walked with a clarity he hadn't felt before. Her passing was not an ending to everything she built, but a passing of the torch she had carried alone for far too long. Now it belonged to him. The next several days became a blur of arrangements, condolences, legal confirmations, and ceremonial procedures. The board expressed their sympathy with sincerity. Advisors offered support. Even those who once doubted him approached with newfound respect. They understood now that he wasn't stepping into leadership solely because of inheritance. He was stepping into it because he carried the strength of the woman who shaped the empire from behind the scenes. A private service was held for close family and a few trusted individuals from the organization. Marcus's sister wept openly, her children holding on to her hands. Marcus stood beside her, a steady presence. When it was time for him to speak, he stepped forward quietly. He didn't talk about wealth or business or power. He talked about Lillian Reed, the grandmother who taught him kindness first and resilience second, who raised 2 children after losing her own daughter, who lived simply but thought profoundly, who protected a vast legacy without ever flaunting its existence. His voice remained steady as he honored her life. When he finished, the room remained silent for a long moment, a silence filled with reverence and reflection. After the service, condolences continued from people he barely knew, but it was the older board member, the one who had known his grandmother in her early years, who approached him last. She embraced him gently. "She trusted you with everything," she said softly. "And now that she's gone, the path ahead will open fully. You're ready." He nodded, though the reality of all that responsibility still felt immense. But he knew she was right. Something within him had settled. He wasn't stepping reluctantly anymore. He was stepping willingly, with purpose. In the weeks that followed, the transition became official. Media outlets caught wind of the story, though the organization released details carefully to avoid sensationalism. When Marcus's name finally circulated in the press, it created a quiet ripple of astonishment. An engineer from a modest background, rising into control of an empire estimated at $50 billion. Journalists requested interviews. Analysts speculated. But Marcus kept his public statements measured, focusing attention on the organization's goals rather than his personal story. His humility made headlines more than any displays of wealth possibly could. The rival group, realizing their efforts had been overtaken by the momentum of unity forming behind Marcus, attempted one final challenge. It was weak, lacking legal grounding and internal support. The board dismissed it unanimously. Alistair's ambitions dissolved in the shadow of Marcus's rise. He avoided public confrontation, but internally his influence diminished. Those who had aligned with him quietly stepped back, unwilling to be tied to a losing battle. The empire moved forward, not with fireworks, but with steady progress. Marcus began implementing new initiatives, strengthening philanthropic branches, improving programs for underserved communities, and ensuring transparency across departments. Executives who once questioned him now collaborated readily, sensing the direction he intended to lead. The organization regained a stability that felt rooted not only in financial strength, but in renewed purpose. In the midst of all these changes, Maya reached out once, just once. She sent a message saying she was sorry for everything, that she now understood what she hadn't before, that she wished him happiness and peace. She didn't ask to meet. She didn't ask for another chance. Her words carried the weight of realization, humility, and acceptance. Marcus read the message quietly. He felt no bitterness, only closure. He thanked her for reaching out and wished her well in return. Then he let the past settle where it belonged, behind him, respected, but no longer carried. His life had widened far beyond the relationship they once shared. He understood now that she had played a part in his story, but not a defining one. Losing her had once felt like a breaking point. Now it felt like a necessary turning. Her departure had pushed him inward, toward growth, toward strength he didn't know he possessed. Their paths had diverged, and that was all right. Some losses carve space for new beginnings. As the months passed, Marcus grew into his role with increasing confidence. He traveled to different branches of the organization, met with communities supported by philanthropic programs, and revitalized initiatives his grandmother had begun decades earlier. He honored her not with grand speeches, but with action. He visited the care facility even after her passing, bringing donations and spending time with residents who remembered her warmth. He kept her spirit alive through the choices he made daily. His sister became one of his closest confidants, offering insight grounded in simplicity and honesty. Her presence reminded him that leadership didn't require leaving behind the roots that made him who he was. He set up educational funds for her children, promising them a future that honored the sacrifices of the generation before them. And slowly, he began creating a life outside of work too, one shaped by balance rather than constant striving. He joined a local community group focused on mentoring young men facing hardships similar to those he once faced. He found joy in guiding others, telling them stories of resilience without ever mentioning wealth. They saw him as a figure of stability, not of status. That mattered more to him than anything printed in the news. One quiet afternoon, months after the succession was finalized, Marcus visited his grandmother's grave. The sky was clear, the air warm. He knelt beside the headstone, brushing away a fallen leaf. He told her everything, about the organization's progress, about the changes he made, about the resolution of the conflict. He spoke softly, feeling no heaviness now, only gratitude for the path she laid before him. He thanked her again for believing in him long before he believed in himself. As he stood, sunlight settled across the landscape, casting long golden lines across the grass. He breathed deeply, letting the moment fill him with tranquility. The life he lived now was not one he would have chosen on his own. It was one bestowed upon him, shaped by history and guided by love. But he embraced it fully, not with arrogance but with commitment. On the walk back to his car, he paused to watch a family laying flowers nearby, a reminder that every story, no matter how grand, returned to the same truth. People shape people. His grandmother had shaped him. Now he hoped to shape the world in ways that honored her. He drove back toward the city, its skyline rising in the distance. The work ahead remained vast and complex, but he faced it with a steadiness forged through loss, growth, and unexpected transformation. His life no longer resembled the quiet days of repairing machinery or the heartache of losing someone who didn't see his worth. Those chapters had closed gently, making space for something deeper. That evening, as he stepped into his office, overlooking the city lights, he rested his hands on the railing and watched as the wind moved through the streets below. He felt calm, grounded, certain. His grandmother's legacy lived not in the wealth he inherited, but in the strength, compassion, and purpose she taught him. He carried her forward in every decision. And in that still moment, he understood that the journey he had taken, from heartbreak to inheritance, from doubt to leadership, was not about proving himself to anyone. It was about becoming the man she always believed he could be. The story of what he inherited would fade in time beneath the story of what he built. And he would continue building with the same quiet determination that guided every step he took. This chapter of his life closed softly, not with fanfare, but with clarity, a clarity that marked the true beginning of the future he was meant to lead.